So what we're going to do is we're going to first sort of briefly introduce ourselves, and then we're going to lay out some of the goals for this session. Talk a little bit about and then we're going to use a case study to basically go through a bunch of different questions that we encourage folks to think through as they go through the process of cooperative. Now, when we put this session together, it was initially supposed to be geared toward having lawyers and or law school students. So we just want to get a sense of who's in the room. So are there any lawyers here? Because we can shift. No lawyers.
I think we should, yeah.
Okay. Are there any law school students? So we have one. Okay. Are there folks in here who have already started a worker cooperative? Can we get hands in the air? And then people who are thinking of starting a worker cooperative? Okay. All right. So this is helpful. What's developers?
Yes.
All right. So who? TA providers, developers.
Okay.
It's all good.
So
A lot
little
fewer
more.
fewer loans for you. So then we should, okay. Cool, so do brief introduction. So, so everyone, good afternoon. Apologies in advance, I'm a little frazzled. I teach until noon, and I drove up here from DC, and I just got here like 2 minutes ago. My name is Julian Hill. I use they, them, he, and pronouns. I'm currently a clinical teaching professor at Georgetown Law in their social enterprise and nonprofit law clinic, basically their transactional clinic. And I mostly work with worker cooperatives, done a good amount of that work in DC, did a good chunk of that also in New York City. So glad to be here.
And my name is Carmen Huertas-Noble. I'm the Dean of Clinical Programs at CUNY School of Law. And I'm also the founding director of its Community and Economic Development Clinic. Before teaching at CUNY, I was at the Urban Justice Center, which is a public interest law firm in New York, and I also taught at Fordham University and have been working with worker cooperatives for the last 20 years. So I'm excited to learn about new endeavors, existing endeavors, and share some of the things we've learned along the way as we've counseled groups that want to form worker co-ops.
Cool, so you wanna?
Sure. So the case study that we wanted to use is a case study from a client that I have permission to speak of. And the client came from a group called Coalition to Save Interfaith. And Interfaith is a medical center in New York City. And medical centers are in quite hospitals, and they're considered safety net hospitals because usually they're in a place where there's not a lot of access to care. So sadly, it was slated to be closed and not receive any funding. And residents and workers got together and started mobilizing and lobbying and brought in union reps, faith-based institutions, and additional stakeholders. And one of the unions that they brought in was 1199, which is another union that I like to lift up because not only the rank and file, but the leadership is also predominantly Black. So this coalition came together. They successfully kept the doors open. And then they were like, well, we need more than just the doors to be open. So they organized to find an African-American woman who would be the head of the medical center. It was a major accomplishment, and not only did she come to be the head of Interfaith Medical Center, she then became the head of 4 different medical centers that were combined. And they did all of this through a participatory process, so they had people going out and asking residents questions in terms of what they wanted to see and what was needed in the community. And out of that participatory research, they identified healthy food. So it's a union co-op that does hydroponic farming that would source the cafeteria in the medical centers as well as serve homebound patients in terms of delivery of produce. And another union co-op that they wanted to, that's in the process of being created, is a hospital furniture making co-op. So that's also in the works. So the idea was to look at the supply chain to the hospital. The hospital is an anchor, so long it continues to be funded. That's my nervous laughter. Look at the supply chain and see how local residents could benefit, and also identifying health as an issue of wealth, right? As wealth generation. If we're not well, we can't get to work. If we're not well, we know this, right? So working with them to conceptualize the projects, because they want to create an ecosystem of union co-ops and not just a one-off, has been very insightful and inspiring, and is an example that, you know, I know we all know this in this room, that Black people can get it done on their own, right? We need philanthropists to trust us more, to be willing to invest, because the ideas are ours. We're closest to the problems, we're closest to the solutions, some of us closer than others, but still we have a different perspective and insight, and that should be honored. And we're hoping, as we do more and more of these conversations, that will catch on with more folks, including bankers and lenders and CDFIs and those folks. You want to talk about conceptualizes? No, right? Doesn't seem, okay. Cutting out the part that was like really targeted towards lawyers.
Well, we could talk about it maybe more briefly, because we do have a developer here.
That's true.
And people should probably just
Right.
kind of be aware.
So sometimes as attorneys, especially client-centered attorneys who consider themselves movement lawyers, we get approached to work with community groups or, you know, configurations of people. And sometimes we're not approached by the prospective worker owners. We're approached by a nonprofit or approached by another community rep or an elected official. So for us, we start to think, if we're working with them at the conceptualization stage, what is really in the realm that they want to, decision-making that they want to have, and what is it that we really should counsel them, that we can set this up kind of like something to offer the prospective worker owners, but there should be room for them to come back and say, well, you know, this section really doesn't work for me, that section doesn't really work for me. So just kind of trying to be conscious of whose voices that we're listening to, particularly with professionals a lot of times, or lawyers a lot of times want to talk to other lawyers, but, you know, the other lawyers aren't the ones that have the answer. It's you and the people who are starting the co-op and who are running the co-op.
When you say section, are you talking about bylaws?
Yes.
Can I chime in on
Yes,
this one?
of course.
Yeah, so just a couple other things. I'm trying to think about it from a couple different perspectives. From the perspective of the developer, or even other technical assistance providers, folks who are going to be helping you with your business plan, folks who are going to be helping you with your marketing, all of those other sorts of things. It's important to sort of be aware of where you're kind of crossing the line toward being paternalistic. And I think that, you know, that's something that was lifted up, I think, in a few sessions yesterday within different contexts. And so that's something that is connected to the second point, which is making sure that you're clear that the lawyer is your lawyer and sort of who they're actually serving. So on the lawyer end, we have to always be conscious of who that is. And so, for example, when we're working with a developer, we might say, okay, you're providing XYZ services, we're doing the legal services. And so when we're talking about legal things, the client, the co-op, most of you, has to give us their consent to have you in the space, right? And so thinking about the power that you have as the client to sort of make sure that if there are sensitive things that you don't want to talk about with one of the TA providers in the space, making sure that that's clear. Because there's some contexts where there's a little bit less in the way of clarity. So so an example would be, I would say, with conversions, which probably isn't super relevant for this particular group, but conversions are basically where existing business doing their thing, they sell the business to their employees, so it converts to a worker-owned cooperative. And in those contexts, sometimes the lawyers will play sort of try to play sort of both roles, but in the context of sort of starting up, developing, making sure that you're clear. Can I turn this off?
Is it on?
I think they keep it on because they're recording.
Oh, because they're recording. Right. So being clear around that and your obligations as it relates to confidentiality, right? And so there are certain obligations we have as attorneys to our clients to maintain confidences, and also making sure that the information that we're discussing maintains sort of the benefits that come with being privileged as well, right? And so if you have a third party in the space, i.e. a developer or some other folks, there's certain ways in which that will destroy sort of privilege and sort of, it's not a huge thing in most contexts, but you want to make sure that when you're talking to your lawyer, you're clear, you're asking questions around this. Okay, what are my rights vis-a-vis you? What are your obligations vis-a-vis me?
Can I ask you to go a little deeper and get a specific question? So like in a worker cooperative perspective, especially in a conversion when it's getting ready to convert, and let's just assume for the sake of conversation, you're representing the employees and it's multiple. So does privilege take into effect because all of them collectively are essentially your employees, or do you get permission?
Do you want to talk about group representation, or do you want to?
I didn't hear.
So the question is with respect to, and it sounds like in the context of a conversion, which I think, but also can apply when you just have people.
Startup either, but just let's say if it's multiple people, but they are like
The client.
represented. They're not the developer.
Yeah.
They're not the seller. So all of them are
The workers,
let's just say
or the soon-to-be worker owners. Yeah.
Correct. But so all of them are the same. Does that privilege, is that individualized or is that collective?
So it really depends on the engagement letter or the retainer agreement, and it's something that we refer to as group representation. So if the group is coming together as a whole and wants to make decisions as a whole, then it's a group representation letter, and then that group is the client and is entitled to hear confidential information. But sometimes there's representation, this group representation, but it's individual people represented, and a lot of times that's in a housing context. One thing about worker co-ops and group representation, which I think is important to have group representation, is because just naturally as human beings, eventually we change our minds, some people disagree, and if you're represented individually, one person walking away, if you're all represented individually by the same attorney, one person walking away means the attorney then has to walk away from the entire project, unless they had a group representation engagement letter or retainer. So, I would keep an eye out for that. And then I would also keep, and just to kind of reinforce what Julian has already said, if an attorney says to you that they represent both sides in an arrangement, no. That's just a no. There are times when you can get a waiver and you can ask the client to waive it, but generally speaking, you want your own attorney because you want to make sure that they're zealously representing you. And it's not even to say that the attorney wants to be unethical, but it's very hard, right, if people have opposing interests to zealously represent both opposing interests and actually, do it well and right in both settings. So I know that there's been community benefits agreements where the attorneys have said they represent both the developers and like the community-based organizations, and it's so unethical, and it often means that the community is left, holding the bag and doesn't get what they should out of these processes. Yeah.
Because then it would be in the best interest of the lawyer, because then they can hear both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens a lot in the conversion context. There are definitely arguments in that space around whether or not that's cool or not. So, yeah. Anything else you want to talk about on that, or you want me to move on to the next one?
I think we can move on.
Okay. Cool. So, you got your, you know, your lawyer, hopefully you've had these kind of conversations, and now you're sort of thinking about actually forming your entity, or thinking about the idea of forming a legal entity. And so typically what'll happen is you'll sort of want to think about which one do I use, right? And so just as a disclaimer, you know, we're not giving any kind of legal advice here, right? We're just giving you, so this is all for educational purposes. And I say that particularly because within the context of your entity choice, it's very state specific. I'm barred in DC, I'm barred in New York. I don't know what they got going on in Mississippi. I don't know what they got going on in Cali. I mean, I know a little bit, but I'm not gonna be out here sort of talking with any level of detail about it. But so what I do want to do is introduce at least some of the common ones, just so you kind of have a sense of what may or may not be around, and you definitely want to make sure you consult with a lawyer just to make sure that that is cool. And I'll start with the ones, since the case study is based in New York, I'll start there. So one of the more common entities that you'll see in most states would be LLCs, right? So a lot of times, for a number of reasons, and we'll get into it a little bit later, some folks will want to choose an LLC for their cooperative structure because of the flexibility, right? So some of the things that people think about is the fact that from sort of a labor standpoint, you have a little bit more flexibility, oftentimes because everyone's sort of a member owner, to not sort of have some of the obligations of being an employer. And so what that means is that you can, in some instances, again, it's case by case, you can sort of wait till you sort of get a little bit bigger, have enough in the way of assets to start being able to offer some of the things that would typically be required with respect to having employees, like workers' comp, those sorts of things. Also, you can have multiple different types of classes within the LLC, and so there's a lot of flexibility there. And so that's, I would say, pretty popular. In New York, they have what's called a worker cooperative corporation, which is a corporate form that sort of has some of the different types of features that you would see in a traditional corporation. You got a board of directors, and we'll talk a little bit about this a little bit later, there's some advantages from a taxation standpoint with respect to that entity form that allows you to kind of get some of the benefits of a corporate tax form with a little bit of some of the negative aspects of that not being the case. In DC, we have a limited cooperative association and a general cooperative association, which is kind of like a mix between an LLC and a corporation. Is probably the best way I can describe it. So there's that. Illinois, I want to say in 2016, they have passed a law where they have sort of a worker cooperative association, which kind of mixes some of the things that are common in LCAs with what you have in sort of LLCs. And the thing I'll say about that entity and then the LCAs is that they bake into the law the ability to have what are called investor members. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the nuances and the things you need to think about when bringing on investors a little bit later. And then finally, I'll say in Wyoming, earlier, I want to say maybe middle of last year, they made an innovation on their LLC law to have what are called democratically autonomous organizations, or DAOs. So folks are kind of into crypto, all that kind of stuff. This is an entity that uses the sort of contract model that's with crypto to kind of allow for a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you think about what the role of crypto can be, how you sort of autonomize some of the different arrangements. And so, come again? The entities I mentioned? Yeah. LLCs, worker co-op corporations, limited cooperative associations, worker cooperative association, which I said is kind of, I think it's only in Illinois. I don't know if any other places have that yet. And then democratically autonomous organizations, or DAOs.
In what state is that, democratically autonomous?
Wyoming is the only one that I know of. I mean, there are places, so depending on who you ask, right? So there's some folks, I'll just say as an official legal entity, I believe that Wyoming is the only place that kind of has it, but there are people who use other legal forms to try to sort of incorporate some of the mechanics of DAOs within it. But that's not my space, I'll just say that. I know it's out there. I know the attorneys who are kind of doing that work, and I say, good for you, one day. But yeah. And so oh yes.
I have a question about the LLCs. it, do you need to have all of your workers, like if you're trying to convert into an LLC to be a worker-owned cooperative, do you need to have everybody that's already a worker to become a partner when it's first incorporated, or can you add on other people to be partners as like other folks are coming on?
So you already have the LLC established?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I'm going through this right now. So on the side, I have my own little project that we're actually turning into a cooperative as well. And so it kind of gets to my next point, which is your governance documents. And so typically, if it's an LLC, for example, you have an operating agreement. For any kind of corporate form, it's usually bylaws. And when you have an LLC that sort of is existing, and again, you want to sort of talk with some folks about it, what you sometimes can do is you can modify or amend your operating agreement so that it actually incorporates some of the different types of, I thought it was, okay. So that it incorporates some of the mechanics that are fundamental to cooperatives, so one member, one vote, and even sort of the different classes that you might have and how you divvy up profits with respect to it being based off of people's labor. So, so not necessarily, but it depends on the context. You may have to do something more extensive.
And a quick follow-up. So if you know, once you have your LLC and it is formed as a cooperative, and you want to hire somebody else, is it easy to be able to get them to, or as a worker owner, is it easy to be able to have them be join as a part of the LLC, or is that a hard process?
So it depends. And it kind of depends on what the cooperative is, the industry that it's in, what your criteria is, how long it takes to learn the craft of what you do. So there are different
From a legal standpoint.
Well, it's flexible because you can decide. It can be as simple as we just vote. In a lot of instances, like we majority vote, we bring a member on. But some cooperatives will say you have to kind of be sort of a provisional member for a certain period of time, 9 months. A year. Again, it depends on it depends on the.
Just change the update who's going to be a partner in LLC, just whenever the process that you've outlined.
You look at your operating agreement, whatever you got up in there, make sure it's obviously in alignment with like the law for your state as well, and then you kind of go through that process. And you can always kind of follow whatever the law is for amending your operating agreement, and then add these are the 5 criteria for becoming a member, or 3, or 2, or whatever the case may be. And sometimes it's very general, kind of in your operating agreement, and then you might have more specific things in what's called like a membership manual. That's kind of more of your operational, like stuff like, do we have a uniform? How do we do vacations, right? It's almost like what you would imagine an employee manual, but you're not, particularly in an LLC, you're not an employee, so it's like your membership manual. So you can kind of have some of that spelled out there as well. So let's take, how do you want to do this? You just keep taking questions?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, we out here. So you here in the middle, and then Omar, then you were next, I think, and then Omar.
Yeah, just a follow-up to what he's saying. So.
She was first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, you can follow.
Yeah, I just want to follow up.
Oh, yeah,
on
go
the
ahead.
same topic.
Yeah.
So for the board, if you have a entity set up, the board has operating agreements. Can a binding resolution pass according to the articles? Can that also alter what's in the articles? So let's say, for example, if the articles say that there only could be 10 people as members of the board, can the board then, the majority vote, bind a resolution, and will that resolution hold the same weight as the articles?
As the articles of incorporation
Yeah,
or in the bylaws?
or the bylaws.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you say the question one more time?
Okay, so basically, we have.
I'm sorry, I have like 50% hearing loss, so I'm just gonna
Yeah, let's
stand
take
up.
the last drop here.
No, it's not you, it's me. But I'm just gonna move a little closer. So I'm
Yeah,
like, say that
so
again.
the bylaws may say it can be 13, between 5 and 13 board members. Could the board then do a binding resolution to say that it could be 20? And how, does that stand in, is that like legally?
Yeah, so legally you can always increase the size of your board, and then, I'm just gonna move closer to the mic for the audio. You can always increase the size of your board according to your bylaws. So whatever voting mechanism you have in place in terms of how many people it would take to vote yes on increasing the board size becomes important. And that really, and it also could depend on statute and the state that you're in. So I would look at the incorporation statute under the governance section, the bylaws section, and see what it says about board size and expanding the size.
So my question really was around a bigger picture. So of course we know the standard legal structures, and then you kind of gave some exceptions, which were some of these LLC corporations or cooperative corporations or the DAO. Do you see a trend kind of moving towards creating something specific for this new, well, I should say new landscape, but for cooperatives going forward, just in a bigger scheme of picture? Like, I mean, we know what the standards are, but now that there are some examples of where states are kind of creating these, do you think that would take a trend on a bigger scale?
I can
And then
start,
yeah.
I guess. So if we take kind of a snapshot of where we're at now, there are probably more states, I'm pretty sure there are more states than not that have pretty either old cooperative laws, like agricultural specific laws, or nothing really kind of like aligned with worker cooperatives at all. And so a lot of places you will probably have to do an LLC. And so there are states, and I've talked to like some folks, actually here in Maryland, I was talking to some folks somewhere else, I think it might have been Arizona, somewhere out that way. Like I know that there are desires to have conversation around what it might mean to sort of have a newer type of entity. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so I have to admit, when I used to get that question, I used to think, you know, at least in New York, I'm like, the limited liability company statute is so flexible that we can work within that statute and take from whatever statute model that you've seen and incorporate in that. But, you know, this might have been over 10 years ago, maybe even longer, working with Omar and Green Worker Cooperatives, and really hearing that it's not so much about the statute, because in New York, and I don't know if this is true in other states, if you do incorporate under the LLC, then you can have co-op in your name. And in terms of growing recognition and awareness of our movement, to me that was like, yeah, that's a good enough reason. Let's figure out how to make this work. So I think that, you know, if you are in a state that has one of these special models, that's great. If you're not, there are ways to incorporate what you see in other models, or coming together and lobbying to get the legislature to either carve out a special piece of the legislation under LLC, or create something entirely new as a way to kind of brand and grow our movement. Because I think there are plenty of co-ops that people don't know are co-ops, including like Land O'Lakes and Florida's Orange Juice, although those are producer co-ops, but still, without that, you know, corporate indicator, people don't really know unless they visit your website or something.
So maybe take one more and then go to the next. Oh wait, we got Omar, and then we'll do it.
Okay.
So actually, it was on that last point that I was wondering about. I'm curious about the non-worker co-op statutes that are out there, the ones that are older, is more traditional. I'm spending more time now and meeting and working with folks that are not doing worker co-ops, they're doing other kinds of co-ops, like shared services co-ops and some consumer co-ops. And so I'm curious, you know, what are the options that are available for them, and are they, well, they're different from the worker co-ops. Is there stuff that for anybody that's wanting to start a consumer co-op, you know, or some producer co-op or something like that? What's something that's more standard that they can go to?
So my two quick thoughts are one, I haven't operated in that context, right? So I've only been kind of in New York and sort of DC where we've kind of had those kind of options. I'm about to move to Georgia where there's fewer options. I'm sure. So I can't. So I don't have a great answer for that because that's not hasn't been my.
New York too has. I mean, it has the cooperative.
Yeah, it has the cooperative corporation.
Law, so
Yeah.
There are other parts beyond the worker co-op. I don't know the other parts. So.
Right.
Well,
There's an aspect to it, but I would want to look at the statute. But there is, in New York, under the statute, there is a way to form a worker cooperative that's more about shared resources and referral. And I think that's section 5A, but I would really need to look. But I'm glad to kind of circulate it to the list.
Because there's the General
Afterwards.
Cooperative Corporation, there's the 5A, I think there's like a specific like an agricultural, and there's a fourth, and there's like 4 under that specific law. But I haven't engaged.
I haven't really either. I would say in terms of producer co-ops, I think the USDA contacts are really helpful. And, you know, they've been running for a really long time, so I think there's lessons to be learned there. And they tend to be receptive to when you reach out to them and ask questions.
And we'll just do one more here before we move to the next
Mhm.
topic.
Yeah, so I know that we're all here and, you know, there's definitely a large community around co-ops and supporting those, and I think it's a growing community. But what have you seen as being successful pushes? Like what have been examples of successful pushes towards new statutes for cooperatives, so more innovative kind of structures?
Yeah.
I mean,
No, I was gonna say I feel like you mentioned some of them in the beginning. Maybe just what
Yeah, I
the
mean,
differences.
the most recent one I could think of, I think it wasn't Illinois.
Yeah.
With the Worker Cooperative Association. And I think just to kind of, I guess the thing about like some of the ingredients maybe that were part of that, and you should talk to Renee Hatcher, who's here somewhere and was involved in that process, but it sounded like they had a clinic that they were working with that does transactional law work, which is her clinic, and they had a bunch of different stakeholders, folks who did co-op development work in different ways. And they kind of had a coalition. I think there was a white paper that was involved that they drafted to kind of talk about the rationale for having a new law and the ways in which the existing laws were inefficient. And then, you know, I guess they put together some kind of campaign and, you know, figured out sort of what numbers they needed to get this thing passed. Found a champion or two. But I would say that's the most that's the one that I know the most about in part because I know Renee.
What is this? I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're talking about.
So in Illinois, they passed a new cooperative, a new statute for a cooperative entity. I think it's called the Worker Cooperative Association,
Okay.
which was, I want to say it was 2019, I think it was 2016. But I was describing what I understand to be the ways in which they were able to get there, because there are a lot of different states that have been thinking about, we need something different, and so that was one campaign that I know was successful, and those are some of the elements that I know of it that help make it successful. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Can I ask just a quick clarifying question? So what you mentioned in New York, the worker co-op
Corporation?
corporation,
Mm-hmm.
that's under the LLC or is that separate?
Nah, it's
Cooperative corporation statute.
Sorry?
Is the cooperative corporation statute in New York? No.
so you want to do the governance?
Sure. So, you know, you've met with your attorney, you decided what kind of entity you want to form, and then you are at the governance stage in terms of, depending on your entity, depends on the name of the document, but if we're saying LLC, it would be the operating agreement. And some of the main aspects of the operating agreement that you want to kind of nail down right away is what's going to be your decision-making process. You know, for cooperatives, it's usually one worker, one vote. But are there times when you would want to have it make a decision by a majority vote? Sometimes you want consensus -1, sometimes you want a supermajority, depending on how important that decision is to each member. People may want an individual voice, or people may feel like, oh, representative democracy works in this aspect. So in terms of like defining membership, you get to set that criteria and who is going to be part of it. Julian mentioned earlier, a lot of worker co-ops have a provisional time period to make sure that the prospective worker owner can do the job well, and also is a good fit in terms of the ethos of the co-op. And also in terms of deciding how you're going to share the profit, as well as, you know, how you're going to resolve conflicts. And as the worker cooperative movement has grown, we have also seen a growth in the need for conflict resolution, which becomes very important. And a lot of us are, that's my nervous laughter, and a lot of us are exploring that right now. And one model as a way to kind of address, because inequities can still occur in a co-op, is to unionize. So union co-ops for a lot of people is, you know, it seems counterintuitive, because folks are like, well, if you're the owner, why do you need a union? But if you're an individual owner and there's 100 people, you can be outnumbered, right? You know, like majority, minority. So having those kind of protections in place, and the union comes with, you know, years of experience in conflict resolution, and can play an important factor in that. And I also have permission to say this, in terms of cooperative home care associates in the Bronx, when I asked them that question too, the example they gave was, you know, they would have, as a co-op, they were a co-op first before they became unionized. As a co-op, they rarely got any grievance complaints. And when they unionized, they saw more grievance complaints. And the grievance were more in the sense of, well, I don't really care for this kind of staffing. And, you know, there was a fear that if some people were, you know, had a concern that if they speak up about something, that might mean that they get like the hardest cases, or there might be some, you know, we're human. So having the union as like another added layer of protection was it really helpful in that regard. And I think that that's probably true for a lot of co-ops, but it doesn't have to necessarily be within the unionized co-op context. You know, in terms of finding mediators who understand the ethos of cooperatives and bringing them in to mediate. And I would say this, you know, a lot of times people ask me to mediate. I'm like, I'm a middle child, and I'm kind of used to mediating with a little m. But I'm like, but you want an expert mediator, right? Like, you want that person who has dedicated their life to doing this work. And if you can't get that person, then at times I am willing to say yes. But mostly because it's going to benefit the group the most to have someone who's actually trained and skilled in that area. Mm-hmm.
I think it's consensus governance, and you have mentioned that that's something that you're familiar with, or you don't necessarily recommend it, but I know some big co-ops that actually do deal with decision making based on consensus.
So I've worked with a number of groups who do consensus-based decision making, but it's kind of been consensus -1. So the concern being that there could be one person that holds everything up. And for some people, that's okay, and for other people, that's not okay, so they do the consensus -1. Mm-hmm.
And just on that, were you gonna add? Okay.
I was gonna add to his,
Mm-hmm.
there's another method that's very close, where consensus means everybody says yes. Where consent, it may be a little bit lower bar, where nobody says no, and that's a lot more easy to reach.
Yeah, we use that one time, it's like consent, unless there's an objection, because you can't just withhold consent without having an articulated objection that solves the go through stuff.
I like that model.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I had a question maybe for you about that, because you started using the consent model, but I find that it's hard to, one of the challenges with practicing it is it's like hard to it's like, I guess voting is easier to understand. So like, how do you kind of
you need to have a reasonable doubt, and it's not just like any doubt. It's like an objective, articulable position that can be supported with something other than like some credit that they have. And if not, then it's not really a legitimate objection.
Right.
And that's what we kind of use.
And I'll just add to that. So I did a training on sociocracy like 6 or 7 months ago or something like that, which kind of integrates a lot of that, in addition to other things like doing rounds and making sure everyone's actually heard when you talk about things. And in addition to, basically part of it, I think, is having some very clear rules of engagement around, okay, not only can you articulate your objection, but you can articulate the objection vis-a-vis the goal that we're trying to meet as a cooperative, and how this doesn't help us. You know what I mean? So there, integrative consent. I mean, there are a lot of different models out there. I did it. Only reason I mentioned sociocracy is because I just did a training on that, and it includes a lot of those elements and some others that might be helpful to think about.
Okay. Yeah. Thinking about just like the sequencing of like figuring out the governance once you transition the LLC into a cooperative. How many worker owners, what percentage of worker owners do you need to have already involved when you're generating that structure? So for example, for the cooperatives that we have like one worker owner plus the nonprofit that serves the LLC that's gonna be a member. But our vision is that, the business is gonna grow and that at some point there may be 15 worker owners. Does it make sense to just continue to operate as an LLC and just pay out dividends and maybe write bylaws and operating agreement that speak to the spirit of a cooperative until there are more worker owners? Or I guess from your perspective, when does it make sense to kind of fully integrate into that model?
After you guys, respond?
Come
I
again?
want to respond quickly after you guys respond.
To that question?
Yes.
Go ahead, you can respond. You got it.
So it's not either or, it's like both and. I'm gonna take this off. So you have to do both along the way within the context of like the law in the United States and the accounting fiscal priorities, which is also like the legal part. So I'll give you an example. Corporation Jackson started off in 2014, and we operated as an LLC we operate as an LLC. And we got our nonprofit, federal nonprofit status in 2015. So when we had to do an audit, not because the government, the U.S. or Mississippi, which is basically like the tiny U.S., said, oh, we need to audit you, it was because the foundation and the folks who said we understand and we'll give you some money until we have a nonprofit said we can't give you any more until we have an audit. So we ended up doing 4 audits in 2016 because we had to do the LLC, the nonprofit, 2014, LLC, nonprofit, 2015, right?
Oof.
Ooh, yeah. And then through the audit process, the auditor, who is Kanji, who's Nigerian, who reminds me of my grandfather, was like trying to explain how all of the financial stuff works. And he's like, you have what? You have members? Okay, so basically those members who pay whatever own the LLC, right? And then the nonprofit has the structure. So I say that to say that like we're building it along the way, and you shift to where you're at. And I was like, phew, when 2017 came, because at a certain point we operated more out of the nonprofit than the LLC, and there wasn't a requirement by Mississippi to do an audit for the LLC. But at a certain point, Mississippi says, oh yeah, if you make above this amount, now you have to do an audit every year. So we've been doing audits every year because we were behind and catching up for a good reason, a great reason. That's like almost unheard of for nonprofits
So we've been playing catch up ever since
Mm.
because we did not have the capacity to like have an internal audit, right? Like I've worked for big nonprofits like Lutheran Social Services in New York, and they have an accounting department.
Yeah.
Small nonprofits have like a couple of people, and you do an internal audit before the auditors come, not like da 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 da. So, and I'm not even sharing the co-ops and the layer of the co-ops and how that works within the umbrella of cooperation and access, and them having to be like autonomous and do their thing like you guys are talking about, make decisions. And for us, they're like semi-autonomous.
So thank you for, and we want this to be a space where folks can share perspectives, and that's helpful. So appreciate you. Is it Saki?
Yes.
Cool. The only thing I'll add is, obviously it's state specific. It's kind of specific to your arrangement, but it's just some questions or some considerations to think about is, particularly if you already kind of have a structure in place, just thinking about whether or not, like in what capacity you bring people on, right? Because as we talked about before, you could also, typically you'll have sort of provisional members who are on for a certain period of time. If the organization's been working for a while and you've already had like 3 folks who've actually been doing all the work, and it's like y'all are basically already full members, so kind of taking into account what people's contributions, what their capacity is, what's the precedent you want to set for how you move forward, and then definitely talking to an accountant and getting a sense of what some of the implications would be from a tax standpoint, particularly because you got a nonprofit engaged, and again, that's federal stuff, that's state tax stuff you need to kind of take into account. That's all I got for now.
And you manage the state versus the federal. So like, if we cannot raise money because Mississippi is like, oh yeah, you still owe us this, we pause on local money and keep going with the 501c3, and that is legal, and we have done that. So like you said, the state. And then I would add the layer of your politics, because that's what I heard since I came into the room. Yeah.
Did you say layer of your politics?
Add on the layer of your politics.
Okay, add on the layer,
because, like,
yeah, absolutely.
if you're willing to do the consensus and stuff that you guys are all talking about.
Yeah, and then depending on those politics, to be transparent, sometimes you're in a collaboration with a nonprofit that you're completely aligned with, and sometimes co-ops are in collaboration with nonprofits that they're not necessarily completely aligned with, and you might want to bring in at least one more worker voice to kind of balance against the nonprofit. I mean, there's so many ways to think about it depending on who the folks are at the table. But I do think it's a conversation worth having. Where are you from? Georgia, with an attorney in Georgia.
We should talk, because I'm moving.
Yeah.
I'm moving.
Yeah, so we're anti-capitalist, y'all. Nonprofit. We started an LLC to be able to run the cooperative.
Okay.
The main one that we have 3 businesses that we'd like to transition into cooperatives. The one that's furthest along is CMOS. So we make CMOS shells, things like that.
I heard of y'all.
Most of the people who are like supporting the business of the LLC co-op that we want to become a cooperative are employees of the nonprofit. So they would not become worker owners because they're already employees of the nonprofit. The nonprofit would just have like 1 member represented. And then we're place-based, so we want to hire people from the community to become worker owners. But we're early on in the process of that. And so our thought process is, should we create bylaws and operating agreements that have a cooperative like basis, because Georgia doesn't have a co-op designation, and then hire worker owners and amend that based on their input, or should we operate as an LLC as we are, and then
Yeah, I mean, the last consideration I'll mention, and then we'll move on to the next topic, unless, if that's cool with folks, is who you want to be, like, the engagement piece in terms of how many voices do you want to be a part of actually doing the operating agreement, right? Because there's a difference between we put together an operating agreement, me and Carmen, and then we invite all of y'all to the co-op, versus, you know, maybe all of us are kind of working through, which is a more tedious process, but also is more, you know, is obviously more inclusive and could generate some more nuanced and more beneficial ideas and contributions to it. So we wanted to move next to, so you got, you know, the co-op, formed it, let's say you got your operating agreement. One thing that's important to think about, and I don't hold myself out to be a securities law expert, but you do need to think about this area called securities law, which is basically an area that is governed sort of federally by the Securities Exchange Commission, and there are also state laws around securities as well. And securities is a very wide scope of what that includes, but for your purposes, when you have a co-op and you're bringing on members as owners, what's typically happening is they're paying some membership fee, whatever that might be, and then they become a member, right? So they have an equity stake, right? So part of just because I'm not sure where everyone is, one of the differences between a co-op and a traditional business when it comes to profit sharing is that in a traditional business, capital dividends, right? So if I put in 90% of the money and Carmen puts in 10% of the money and we got profits, I'm gonna get what percentage? 90. I'm gonna get 90 because it's a capital dividend. Your money is what buys you, gives you access to profits. And co-ops is about your work and your labor. But these are still, you're still a member, and that still could be considered a security. And so oftentimes when you have just the folks who are like the patron members or the worker owners, you don't have to worry about being sort of seen as a security, or you don't have to worry about registering with the federal government or the state, because you're sort of a participant. There are different tests on the federal level that they take into account with respect to whether or not you need to register. Where it can get tricky is when you have investor members, or even like community members, right, who might not necessarily be workers with the co-op, but who put money in with the idea that they're expecting a return, right? And so that share, and it could be a different type of class. You have a community class, you have like an investor class like we talked about before. If you have a limited cooperative association, worker cooperative association, you need to talk with your lawyer about that analysis with respect to, okay, is this a security? And if it's a security, is there an exemption, right? And so different states, again, have different approaches. One common approach, and this is something, because I just did this analysis here over in DC, is where the people who are going to be investors are all like in your locale, like in your state. And so if it's like what's called an interstate offering, in a lot of places, that'll kind of allow you to not have to do like a full registration, but there might still be paperwork that you need to put in. I had a client who didn't do some of that paperwork, and it's not looking good for that client, right? And so that's kind of a nuanced thing that I don't expect you to like fully grasp, understand right now. We just want to give you some of the questions to be thinking about. Be like, hey, so, you know, lawyer, what's your name? Kiana? So lawyer Kiana, some lawyers talking about security stuff. Like, can you walk me through, like, just know that that's a thing out there, so you can get some clarity around, oh, like, you're good because we don't have investor members, or whatever the case may be. Yeah. Did you want to talk about labor stuff?
Yeah, I can talk about labor a little bit. You know, for me, I feel like it's a lot of the work has been a response to poor labor laws and poor workplace conditions, which we're all aware of. But in terms of when you're starting your worker cooperative, or you're already up and running, and you're hiring people in the beginning, and you're not necessarily hiring them as a worker owner right out the gate, how you hire people, one thing to be in the vein of things to look out for and ask your lawyer about, one thing to be cognizant of is there's a lot of misclassification of employees, and that gets scrutinized closely. So if you are hiring someone, speak with an attorney. I believe it's 7 factors. There's a very specific test that's used to figure out whether someone who's working for you is in fact an employee or an independent contractor. And it's, you know, it's an area where even attorneys get it wrong sometimes. So I would definitely consult an experienced attorney around the classifications you give to people who work for you before becoming worker owners to avoid any liability around that. Mm-hmm.
Very often I get the question, what's the difference between an employee and a worker owner?
Right. So, and, you know, and that's a hard one, and it depends, right? As lawyers love to say, it depends. Some worker owners want to be classified as an employee, so some places say employee owner, and they want the traditional benefits of coming with that classification. And there are different definitions of what constitutes an employee at the state level and federal level. And then sometimes people do not want to be in the category of employee. At times that's because of immigration concerns, because you are allowed to own, and sadly not necessarily work if you don't have proper documentation. But as we all know, people need to live, and people get creative, and we find legal and ethical ways to move forward.
And the only thing I'll add is that there are certain legal entities that sometimes will more predispose you to being classified as an employee. And so there are a lot of concerns around like corporations and the idea that typically you're going to get paid sort of W-2 wages, and the connotation that might have with respect to there being an employer-employee relationship between you, the worker owner, and the worker cooperative. And there's a little bit more in the way of gray area and some area for flexibility with LLCs, because there's not always the presumption that a member of LLC is also an employee, right? And as Carmen mentioned before, there are specific tests that your lawyer will kind of take into account to analyze whether or not you are considered an employee. And a lot of it more or less has to deal with control. Like, how much control and autonomy do you have? Like, are you voting just like all the other members? Are you able to benefit in terms of profits like the other members? Is someone, when you don't come to work, is there this sort of hierarchy where someone is like chastising you and supervising you? So those are things that you need to take into account, or your lawyer should sort of help you take into account, where the legal entity might provide some more flexibility around what that classification might be, but it's ultimately a very fact-specific interrogation.
No, you got it. I understand the professors of control and, smart security and stuff, but the question that arises, both raised was the distinction between state law and federal law as it relates to some of the things you're talking about. So it's the standard situation where the federal law is going to take place, where people are filing different things and doing different operational stuff. How does that apply? Are they doing 2 different forms ultimately, or do they have 2 responsibilities, to the federal and to the state, in terms of their response, in terms of their documentation, et cetera, et cetera?
You want to take it?
Sure. I mean, I can start, and I think for me, usually think of it in terms of the stages. So we started talking about formation. So the entity formation usually happens on the state level, where you choose limited liability company, a B Corp. That's at the state level in every state. And then, for tax purposes, that's at the federal level. Some cooperatives, if you're under the cooperative statute, there's something called Subchapter T that you could avail yourself of. Or you just have to and even when you're if you're forming as an LLC, you have to let the federal government know how you're going to be taxed, how you're electing to be taxed. If you're electing to be taxed as a corporation or something else. So the lawyer will kind of have a checklist, go over it with you, and let you know what has to be done on the state level and what has to be done on the federal level. And a good lawyer will then even tell you, even as, you know, representation may end, these are the things that you should be looking out for in the future. Like, these are your reporting requirements under the federal law. These are your reporting requirements under the state law. To give you that as a resource, if they don't give it to you, you should ask for it. To give you that as a resource so that you yourself can, you know, make sure you avoid pitfalls and get things in on time, which we, you know, I more so in the nonprofit world where I've seen people miss, you know, significant deadlines that actually jeopardize their tax exempt status or something like that. You know, people are very busy working, and often the IRS can seem pretty intimidating. But what I say to folks too is, if you don't want to look at the envelope, just pass it to your attorney. But don't come with like the whole, I mean, if you're there, then come.
Yeah.
But if you're not there, don't wait until you get, you know, the pile gets this big and you're like, I don't know what's in these envelopes, but help me. Which we will do, but it's easier to do if we're, you know, if we're engaged sooner. And if we let you know what you're supposed to expect, so you don't get, you know, fall into that trap.
And just two quick additional points. Sometimes the more local you get, the rigor or the standards can be higher than the federal law, right? So like state laws might require more. In like a space like New York City, I mean, the city, you know, they might have things that are also even more specific around certain benefits that people are supposed to get as employees. And so there's that dynamic that's at play, as well as the fact that, just elaborating on what Carmen was just saying, when it comes to labor and it comes to tax, the IRS, and I guess this, you know, in the state agency of like the labor agency that has purview over the state, they typically don't play. And so those are things you really, again, if you got a lawyer that's really trying to look out for you. Because part of the thing that's important is wanting to get in a situation where you don't have to be super reliant on your lawyer. Like, oh, we want to change our bylaws, so we got to go to our lawyer. Like, oh, you know, we want to do, you want to, ideally you'll be in a situation where you can kind of be a bit more self-sufficient, have a checklist. And that, at least that way, if you do need to go back to a lawyer, it's a more sophisticated conversation. Like, oh, you know, you said I need to look at this thing. We put the forms together, but this is one part we don't know, versus we need to do this thing and we don't have any kind of clue. On to tax stuff, which we talked a little bit about. So now we'll switch, elaborate a little bit more on the tax piece. So, you know, you got the co-op, you got your operating agreement, you got your employees or your member owners, whatever you want to call them. You've done the securities analysis. You know where people are situated in terms of labor. End of the year, you made a bunch of money. It's profit time. You're trying to figure out how you're gonna, you know, allocate this coin. And so I'll try to, again, because we had kind of geared this initially toward lawyers. So I'll try to break it down to 3 buckets in terms of common ways that you might be taxed depending on the type of entity that you have. So has anyone here heard the concept of pass-through taxation? Can I get a hands in the air? No, okay, so maybe y'all can help me out. So somebody tell me what's pass-through taxation. Anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, since I know the nonprofit can form, at least I'm from Pennsylvania, so a nonprofit can form a LLC, and the nonprofit is the single member. And then that LLC operates with all the benefits of the LLC, but for tax purposes, they enjoy the benefits. Is that it? Well, that's not
yeah. So you think should I go in these weeds? Just like real brief.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Boom. So this is one way to think about it.
Yeah.
You've got the legal entity, whatever it is, up here,
Yeah.
and then you've got sort of the worker owners kind of here in the middle, right? So with pass through, what we're talking about is, and this is under, I think, Subchapter K in the code, and this is common with LLCs. They're oftentimes taxed as partnerships, so definitely the LLC, definitely the case. but they can't elect to be taxed corporately, which we'll talk about as the second bucket. When you have sort of the revenues that you're going to get, and sort of the I guess the income, so like once you kind of take into account your costs, what will happen is the taxable income flows down to each of the individuals. And so there's no, although you have to file, you still have to file tax documentation for your LLC, there's no tax obligation that you'll have in terms of, oh, the LLC has to pay X amount. If you make $5,000, if what you have left over is $5,000, and that's your taxable income, and there are two members, it's me and let's just say we worked half and half the whole year, because it's a co-op, right? That's how we do it. If it was 5,000, we would each have 2,500 in terms of the taxable income that we would be responsible for. So what that means is that whatever your tax bracket is in terms of your full income, right, it'll be taxed at that amount, right? So, and what that means is oftentimes that rate is going to be typically higher than the corporate rate, and so oftentimes the liability will be a little bit higher from a tax standpoint with an LLC when you have sort of that structure when it's passed through, and what that also means, if you leave money in the co-op, let's say you have an account, and let's say we got that $5,000, but we left $1,000 in the account because we got this thing coming up, we want to make sure we have it on the side. It's still taxable, and we still have to pay tax on, although it didn't hit either of our bank accounts, which is called kind of like the concept like ghost income tax. Yeah. It's like we didn't get it, but we're getting taxed on it. So that's one bucket, and I'm being very just cursory, just so we can, so you can kind of have a
single taxation.
Yeah, it's the same way.
Yeah, double, right.
Because we're probably going to go next is like double taxation.
Right. So then you got, if you have typically a corporate form, so a C corporation, S corporation you can do pass through as well, but let's just say like a traditional corporate form, you have what's called double taxation. And again, if we look at these as levels, what happens is that the amount of money, so if we had that same sort of 5 stacks, and we kept, and let's say we paid it out, what'll happen is at the corporate level, let's say we didn't pay all of it out. So we got 5,000 in terms of our revenues that we brought in, and then so that would be taxed at the corporate level, right? So whatever the rate, 20-some%, I think. And then let's say of that money, if we were to then pay some of that out in dividends, and so let's say we each gave ourselves 1,000 of that 5. Then that 1,000, which is already taxed up here, because it's being paid to us, we get taxed on that 1,000 as a part of our income. So that slice of it is taxed twice, which is how you get the concept of double taxation. Now, what that means though is that if that money that we left in there isn't on our tax liability, right? It's just that 3,000 that we left there is just taxed at the corporate level, and we're only taxed on 1,000 versus that entire 5,000 that we had to split when it was passed through.
And is it the case that with the pass-through scenario, then the worker owners have to end up doing quarterly self? Yeah. I would just ask that as a question to make sure we're, you know, and because I know some co-ops have even set up, like they will arrange for an accountant to come in to help the worker owners do their individual taxes, because they have to take into account the pass-through taxes as well. So just asking them so that you know and make sure you do it, because then if the worker owners don't do it, that presents a different problem. So again, in terms of a checklist of things you want to cover because you don't want to fall into any pitfalls, that would be one of them.
And then the third and sort of, I guess not final, because maybe there's some other tax things out there. I'm not a tax attorney, so I'll just say that. Is Subchapter T Taxation, which Carmen had mentioned earlier, which is a way through which you can avoid double taxation. So what'll happen is, if you had that sort of 5,000 that came in and that got taxed on the corporate level, and we paid ourselves 1,000 each, right? That 2,000, it's no longer taxed at the corporate level anymore because we paid it out in dividends. We're able to write it off. I'm not sure how it technically works because I haven't actually I haven't worked with a ton of like 5A worker co-ops that have actually kind of gone through that process. But essentially, you get $3,000 that's taxed at the corporate level, and then $2,000 that's taxed at the individual level. And so you avoid it being taxed twice. And so in the second bucket that we were just talking about, it's taxed up here, it's all 5,000, and then 2,000 is taxed here. So your taxable income is really 7,000 functionally, whereas you can avoid that when you do subchapter T because it's not taxed twice. The dividends, the amount that you pay to folks in profits. And you can do, you know, depending on how you structure, you can do things like, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I'm just leave it at that. Yes.
How does self-employment tax figure into it? I'm sorry to ask the question, but does it figure into it, or how do you also, what does it mean in terms of subchapter T? Like I'm sure it completely avoids that, so that's not a problem anymore, but how does that figure into it?
So self-employment tax, it can get tricky with the LLC with pass-through in terms of what's kind of guaranteed income versus what is kind of, yeah, it can get tricky within the context of the LLC in particular, because it's a little bit easier with the corporate form because you kind of already have that division when you do the W-2s where it's split between you and the entity. With subchapter T, I think you're typically still getting W-2 wages. It's just the dividends are different.
So it's technically not self-employment because you have the W-2.
Yeah, nah, I don't think, I'm not 100, I'm gonna just, yeah.
I don't fully understand it, so that's why I'm asking you because
I got you.
I didn't like learning it in class.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
When I looked into it, I saw that dividends would be reported as a 1099-PATR.
PATR, yeah.
Okay.
And so that would be what you would get when you're sort of, I guess, filing the taxes. Yep.
So this is more applicable to consumer co-ops, but if the practice of like REI, like instead of getting an actual like monetary dividend, you get like a discount, a credit store credit, I guess. How does, so is that a way to basically avoid like having to deal with the income tax situation, or?
Yeah, I'm not 100%.
Not that I would want to do
Yeah.
that for workers, but like for consumer, like what is, like, are there other models for consumer co-ops that are more like direct income versus credit, or like pros and cons?
Is that like the food co-ops?
I think it'd be like food costs would be.
An example of where the consumers own, but they don't get paid, but they get a substantial discount on the
Yeah.
food at the co-op. So I guess that's like a similar.
But she said, REI uses that
Without,
model?
they don't get an income, they get,
Well, I guess, yeah.
in replacement, they get the discount.
They can tend to,
I was,
the members get 10%.
you think that's in, I don't know if that's considered income.
Yeah, so you have like $100 dividend, you can buy something
Oh.
for $100.
How it works is that they can use it in the store, or I used to work for REI.
Oh, okay.
So basically you pay $20 to be a lifetime member, right? So, and you get 10% back on all full price items, right, every year. It comes into existence. You can use it in store, or you can cash it out for cash. Now, they have changed this law, because I was still organizing employees around this. We have some issues, but, well, Soho just organized and became a union, so that's a union. It's the first union of 160 plus stores. So they're really big and still secretly doing that work. I just publicly saying it work. But yeah, so that's how that model works. A lot of members don't know the ins and outs of that, and they have changed the bylaws. Right? So what happens is
there's millions of members, but the bylaws have shifted and changed. You don't really have a vote now. So REI has been around since 1938, so it's one of the oldest co-ops. It is started as a co-op, but that has shifted to a corporate co-op, and now they're competing with Amazon and all the big markets, but they control the market in regards to the outdoor industry. So what happens is the smaller business, or not even smaller businesses, like Patagonia's of the world, they have to use REI because REI distribute their products, and they're known to do that. So REI is misinterpreting what an actual co-op should be and should function, and that's the issue too. Like they're co-opting this kind of movement as well. It's not necessarily, I can't even call it a consumer co-op because they have changed the bylaws, and a lot of people don't have a necessary vote in that anymore. And most of the people that's on the board is very, very corporate. And also, they're going more and more, less and less supporting workers to actually work in physical spaces, right, in the stores, and going to autonomy similar to try to compete with Amazon. So,
How is that different? Like, is there, with employees, like, are there any discounts or additional benefits to membership for employees? I'm just curious.
yes, and it's problematic too because a lot of them are enthusiasts of the outdoors, so they do get discounts with the bigger brands. So we do, so what most retail workers, if they're working for a bigger brand, they have discounts with the other brands, so we can get discounts on other products through REI. So if you're an employee there, you get a bigger discount than the consumer.
Is there anything else we have to talk about?
I think so.
Exchange?
No. So it's an internal private, like, agreement with all the businesses that REI have contracts with, similar to Walmart, right? So
They could be sustainable, and I just want to see one exchange some other time.
yeah. So it's very problematic. Right? Very problematic.
I mean, another model that many people are hoping will take off is the multi-stakeholder model, where it's not just the consumers that own, and it's not just the workers, but there are multiple, it's both the consumers and the workers, and possibly even a community-based organization. Because some co-ops are really great for the consumer, but aren't necessarily great to their workers, and just trying to get it to be more holistic and everybody benefit.
In the case of a multi-stakeholder cooperative, to come back to what you were talking about at the beginning, is it recommended to have, as many lawyers as there are classes of members?
Yeah, that's funny because I'm like, how many lawyers take it to change a light bulb? But in that case, I feel a little bit different. And even when we haven't had separate lawyers and just kind of collaborated with co-counsel, we've kind of assigned ourselves the role of like, okay, you are looking at this from this lens and make sure you're covering all the worker protection. You look at it from the consumer and make sure you're, and then come together. But I do think that it is a good idea to have multiple lawyers. Like I said, it's not to be disparaging towards lawyers, but it's very hard, right? Once the interests don't align, then you're in an awkward situation. So I think if you have someone at the table who's clearly there for the workers, and you have someone there who's clearly there for the consumers, or for the deal, so to speak, that it'll benefit. And a lot of times, I just want to quickly say, because we both run clinics, and a lot of times that law schools will have community economic development clinics that are happy to work with, entrepreneurs starting worker co-ops, or who have already created worker co-ops. And in those efforts, a lot of times we get to issues where we're like, okay, that's not our area of expertise, and we co-counsel with private firms or other public interest firms to make sure that everything is covered, including like the tax questions that go into the weeds and things of that nature.
Yeah.
I want to just ask, since you talked about the clinics, because I know one of the things we're trying to figure out is how to find more attorneys, especially Black attorneys, that want to do this co-op work and specialize in that, or even educating, I should say educating them, but giving them information that this is a segment of the law that is also something that can be beneficial, area to specialize in. So just from operating a clinic perspective, have you seen students interested in cooperatives, or is it other types of, I mean, I know plenty of attorneys, they love that economic development part, right? I mean,
Right.
and I mean, they'll run that and do policy and do, you know, government and all those, but from the co-op kind of space, or if they're doing business, they like traditional, you know, but this co-op space, we're still, because we're trying to figure out how to create a listing of Black professionals, or even get attorneys to say, take some continuing ed in this area when you need to take your continuing ed. So do you have any kind of tips or strategies, or what you're seeing, or how you're convincing your law students to, hey, take your clinic or participate in your clinic?
I think in New York City, we've been fortunate there. A lot of our law students are interested in cooperatives, are aware of the Worker Cooperative Business Development Initiative from about 15 years ago. That was the first city to fund the creation of an ecosystem to support worker co-ops. So for me, I see a lot of, an increasing number of students who are interested in worker cooperatives. Now, sadly, like many areas, I still don't think we have enough Black law students. So in terms of Black attorneys coming through, some of us are desperately working on that, and other of us, and we're trying to like pull other people along. But there are, and maybe we could create a list and circulate from based on who we know, and others can add to it. And then I guess I just wanted to say that I know we're out of time. I think we're out of time, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you want to stay
But just quickly, I want to say, because a lot of times when I co-counseled with attorneys, they would insist, no, I want to leave this area of the bylaws vague because it empowers the client, and then they could decide what they want to do later on, which is sound advice, except if that's not what your client wants. And a lot of people who come, including myself, if you come from a background where people have abused discretion, you're not necessarily confident in discretion, right? And saying to the attorney, no, this is what the client wants, it's an embedded protection, and please put it in there. And there's a little bit of back and forth, but eventually they put it in there. So just kind of wanting to raise that, because I feel like it's not only, I know the write-up said, you know, well, what's different when you're counseling Black-led organizations? It's not only Black-led organizations, but I feel like as a group that has experienced this, it does apply to us. So wanting to bring that up.
We should have created that from a legal perspective. The only reason why we do that, clients seem to for a funding purpose, because they want to have, they're getting funds from outside. They want to have as broad of a mechanism as possible to get that money. But I definitely agree with you in terms of, you know, making it firm and sound. But the University of Baltimore, I don't know where you're in.
North Carolina.
Okay. The University of Baltimore does have a particular center that basically focuses on that. They've been really involved in setting up these particular kinds of areas throughout at least Baltimore City. You know, because that's something that's happening right now.
Fantastic.
Question?
I want to know, do you have a reading list that you can share? Maybe from the clinic or some class that you taught that would have some key books on there, or, you know, some overview stuff that we can kind of read to kind of get a grasp of this a little bit more?
Did you guys mention the union co-op model in Cincinnati?
We mentioned the union co-op model, but not Cincy Co-op. But they are a group that works in terms of catalyzing unionized cooperatives, and they have different programs, an incubator, a workbook that you could work from. And I think that workbook does step by step, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're working for it right now.
I've recommended,
Great.
even if it doesn't, yeah.
What is it?
Co-op sensitive book.
Co-op Sensi, they have a workbook for people starting worker co-ops to kind of like go through. It's like activities and, but to your question, yeah, I think we can come up with some. I mean, we kind of already started thinking about books, but also like just different organizations and sort of articles that we can put together to share with folks.
So is there a list that we put our names on to get that?
I was just gonna say, should we do that? Cause how are we gonna?
I thought, have you made an email? So when you registered for I don't know if he's gonna send emails out to everyone who registered, but we can also.
The different groups and taking our names.
Oh, okay,
let's
yeah,
do
that's
that.
cool. Yeah, we can just put it if you wanna get some continuing resources, then you can
I know there's
put
not
your
a lot.
email here, and then we'll make sure to send those out.
But also, you're also volunteer to make sure that like, all the resources get out to everyone. Then you can use the in case folks didn't get a chance to put their names down.
Okay.
Cool. Well, thank y'all for coming.
Yes, thank you
We're
very
hanging
much.
out if you hang out.
I'm like, why is it open till Friday?
Hey, Jasmine, nice to meet you. Julian, yeah. Can I give you one of these?
Yeah, for sure. I just wanted to connect, I know you're from Georgia.
Yeah. Where in Georgia are y'all?
Unincorporated associations, what link does that?
I mean, I'm looking for housing like right now.
From Georgia, right?
But the legal entities
I'm gonna be teaching
accountable
at Georgia State,
for unincorporated
and they want me to start a clinic
and the
probably
unaccountable.
during my second year.
Who's unincorporated?
It's upcoming
So
fall,
basically,
fall 2026.
You have a great
And I want to do
situation,
supporting
subtrust.
solidarity economy, walking type stuff.
Okay.
You have an
And
LLC.
so somebody just connected me
Social
with
enterprise.
Right.
like gangsta.
And then we
Gangsta
have
growers?
a
Yeah, with them very close.
501c3.
And then I
That's
talked
the process
to,
of getting.
I've been talking to some folks here and there, some
But
lawyers,
the
the
legal
Georgia Cooperative
status
Development
is a resident
Center.
is an unincorporated statute.
I talked to
How that work?
Dania from
Like legal.
the Southern,
Now, we passed resolution.
Federation of Southern Cooperatives as well.
So you're an unincorporated
y'all both my info.
association. Are you members in those other formal structures?
Yes.
Text me or
And
call
do you
me.
have weighted voting?
After you finish writing
I'm trying to be there like June 1st.
Then
your
yeah.
info
Like,
down.
so,
Can I get,
when I worked
actually,
on
can I get
colors,
you just for a second, just to take this photo?
the restaurant in New York,
I'll be right back.
we took it to.
Unless you got a dip? Yeah, okay, cool.
I'm just getting
Can I get you?
Yeah.
and so, it's still pretty like,
I wanna move them. All right. I'm like, it just looks sloppy.
I like what y'all doing, y'all. Maybe we should try to get together.
Okay, yeah.
So, also to us,
Very much appreciate it.
Let's go get the other one.
we
So I just wanted to.
Yes. I'm supposed to hop on a call. And this is like gonna be like the third time we tried to do a call and I just like didn't show up.
Well, if you have that, we have your contact, so we can just reach out to continue the conversation.
Okay. Yeah, let me see what's going on. And then, are y'all staying there?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just yeah. And I'll be staying here tonight. So yeah, I'm around.
Alright, we appreciate it. We'll talk
You're
to you.
Jasmine. What's your name?
Kwame.
Kwame.
take the unincorporated bylaws, That will have no equity.
Good luck in Georgia. You're gonna do the people clinic down there?
Yeah, probably not until my second year, so I'm gonna be teaching at Georgia State.